And welcome, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's time this morning. I'm excited to roll out our next series of webinars. So I'll tell you a little bit about the survey, but also about this larger webinar program that we're rolling out today as our inaugural effort to get more information out to the business community regarding current conditions in the 9th District. Let me minimize a few boxes here. So first I want to describe why we're doing a lot of survey work right now. And it really is a COVID data challenge right now. So we're in an environment where the speed of the pandemic has showed us a need for more real-time information. And that's because most macro data right now is time lagged. Unemployment data is 4 to 6 weeks time lagged. GDP figures are even more, 3 to 6 months, depending on the geography. So it's much less COVID relevant right now. And for that reason, we're trying to look for new ways to start filling that information gap. And what we've done is that we're doing a lot more outreach to the business community to ask you directly, how are things going in this COVID environment? And what regional outreach, the area that I work for, what we've done is we've pushed a lot of surveys out to the business community, 11 since mid-March, and we've gotten almost 9,000 business responses. And equally important, we've gotten about 25,000 open comments, which really help also give us a more granular feel for how businesses are doing. I'm going to talk today about this general business survey. We conducted it in mid-July, and we got almost 1,100 responses. But what I also want to point out is that we recently did a construction survey, and in the field right now, we also have a professional services survey that's currently in the field right now. And so what we decided to do, because we have all this new information, is we wanted to find new ways to get that information out to the public. Because if it's important to the Minneapolis Fed in terms of setting monetary policy, really trying to have a great idea about what's happening in real time, we think that information, especially now in this COVID environment, is important for the public, for the business community to have also. So what we've decided to do is create this new webinar series that we're calling Regional Economic Conditions. And it's really an extension of our annual Regional Economic Conditions Conference that we have in January. And we've done that conference for the purposes of basically trying to connect people and the research related to the 9th District economy. Again, we're doing more surveys, more real-time data is being gathered, and these webinars help connect us to the business and community leaders about those real-time conditions. We're also doing a lot more enhanced data sharing. So as I'll talk about in a second, we're doing these surveys through a lot of partnering organizations that get our surveys out to others, and this is an attempt to also get more information directly to those partners and their members. So I want to give a big thank you to our partners. There are too many to list individually, and I apologize for any of the partners that happen to be on the call. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. There are almost 30 altogether partnering organizations that essentially send the survey that we create out to their members or their contact bases. We have every district state represented. We started with state chambers of commerce, and we've just kind of expanded after that. We have a lot of regional chambers of commerce and also a lot of economic development organizations, including those representing minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. So we're trying to get not only geography represented, but we're also trying to get a lot of different slices of businesses so we can better understand who's being affected and how. So let me talk a little bit about the general business survey that I'll talk more about. Again, it was conducted in mid-July, and we had over 1,100 responses. And we had responses through all the states in the 9th District, but we had a little bit smaller response base in the Dakotas, Montana, and the Upper Peninsula. But we did have very broad sectoral response, and we had good representation for minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. So what I'm going to talk to you about today in terms of this survey is I'm going to run you through some trends in revenues, staffing, wages, kind of the normal things that I think we're really interested in about business health right now. I'm also going to look at, because we asked a number of demographic questions, I'm going to be able to give you some survey results by state and by sector, by the size of firm, and also by ownership structure, which presents some interesting findings. And what I want to tell everybody is that these results are a snapshot. This was not a scientifically sampled survey, so technically we cannot say these are that. Because of that, we want to make sure that you understand that these are snapshot. These are not comparable over time. So we just ask that all the results that I present to you and anything else that you might look into with this survey, because we'll have more information online, is just that you interpret all the results with care. Also, while I go here, we're going to use the chat box for questions. We're going to take those at the end, but feel free if something strikes you while I present, type it in the chat box for the host, and that way we can get maybe a backlog of some questions. I'm also interested if anyone has certain feedback or reactions or an experience to share regarding your business. If you wanted to leave that in the chat box as well, I'd love to get additional insights from any businesses out there that have additional feedback to offer. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about are current and future revenue trends that businesses told us about. So I'm going to point out a few things, and then we'll talk about results. So the first thing I want you to pay attention to is the color scheme. For the most part, in most of the charts, the dark red and shades of red are going to be what I'm calling more negative outcomes, okay? So the more red, the worse the outcome, and then lighter shades are improvements. So this first question we asked respondents to tell us about how the most recent period in June and July was compared to April and May. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to see how businesses were improving during and from the depths of the pandemic itself. And then we also asked them what their 2-month outlook was, so what they expected in August and September compared to June and July. And what you're basically seeing here is that firms are continuing to struggle from a revenue standpoint. Roughly half are seeing a negative revenue trend. And if you look at here, so the most recent one, about 50% are seeing some negative revenue trend. In the future, they're expecting actually slightly worse outcomes. So what we've heard not only in this survey, but also in other outreach is that respondents are kind of nervous about the near term. So then we also asked respondents to identify what state they were from. And as you can see here, so we have, for those that are not familiar with the 9th District, it runs roughly the Upper Peninsula in western Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana. So you have all of those geographies represented here. And while you see some variation, the first point I would make about geography is that it matters, but it matters some. And the reason I say that is that for the most part, what you see here is more similarity than difference. Okay, it's not to say there is no difference. Clearly, South Dakota is seeing a different response than Minneapolis, St. Paul, and North Dakota. So there is some involvement, I think, with how states are approaching the pandemic itself and how they are approaching business restrictions. But I would say for the most part, they're more likely on the margins in terms of that influence, in part because response composition matters. And the reason I point that out is what we saw in terms of the response from South Dakota respondents is that we saw more finance firms respond, and they tended to see better outcomes overall. And we also saw no sole proprietor responses, which was a little bit unusual. And they happen to also see poorer outcomes, which I'll discuss in a second. So I don't want to say that geography doesn't matter, but it probably matters a little bit less than what you see on your screen. And if we were to take some of the variations, some of the demographic variations, and kind of wait for those things, what you probably see in this chart is some compression of results. So by geography, things would look a little bit more similar than maybe this chart offers. So we also looked at industry sectors. We asked them to identify which of these they were part of. And again, what you see is that even down here where you saw better results, you still saw close to 50% of finance firms see some negative trend. It just happens to be significantly better than what you see at the very top here with entertainment, recreation, accommodation, food and drink establishments. Again, maybe not surprising if you step back and think about some of the things that are in place right now are nervousness over getting out and being in crowds. So all industry sectors have been hurt, but these two up here have been hurt the most by a considerable margin. We also asked firms to identify their size. And here there's a very, very clear relationship that size matters. Sole proprietors and small firms were much more likely to see more negative outcomes in general. But again, it's not that large firms were not affected. That's not the case at all. If you were to only see this chart or this bar itself, you would see that things are very negative for all firms, even the large ones. It's just by comparison, they're having less stress. And ownership also matters. Okay, so we asked them to identify their ownership structure. And what you see here is that minority women and veteran-owned businesses saw more negative impacts on average than white-owned, the bottom one here. But what I would also point out here is that composition matters here also. Minority women and veteran-owned businesses tend to be smaller, and as I just showed, smaller the firm, the more likely you had negative revenue trends. And they also tend to be overrepresented in those harder hit sectors that I also talked about: food, lodging, accommodation, entertainment, those sectors as well. So now let's get away from the demographics of the response in terms of recent revenue trends. Now I want to talk about some of the other results, some of the other big picture results overall. So we asked about workforce and what effect it's had both from May to July, as well as what they expect by September. And what you see is a fairly similar picture for both, is that about 1/3 of firms have seen workforce cuts, and we expect that to continue over the coming months. So we are seeing some firms that are trying to that have added employees and are still trying to. I actually see a fair amount of that in the construction sector. But some other firms and manufacturing sectors that are seeing strong demand for in certain sectors are also trying to add workers. But in general, what we're seeing is that I think firms are really being tight in regards to their staffing decisions, both over the last 2 months and over the coming 2 months. We also asked about average wages, and here we see that roughly about 1/3 of firms have cut wages. And when they have cut wages, they've actually cut them more than 10% on average. So 10%, more than 10% here, more than 25% here. And we're also expecting a minority, but a fair fraction of firms expecting to potentially cut wages again by the end of the year, or more by the end of the year. This will be the only other slide that I give you another demographic slice of that of one of the things I just showed you. But in terms of July average wages compared to pre-virus, this is the one that really sticks out in terms of looking at it from a different angle. And what you see is that those small firms, sole proprietors in particular, have seen significantly stronger or more frequent wage cuts than any of the other firm sizes. So sole proprietors are essentially cutting their own wages because they're having the most difficulty when it comes to income. So then we also wanted to start asking, this is the first time we asked this particular question. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to try to see how supply was reacting to demand and vice versa, because there are business restrictions out there, there are social distancing issues, and we wanted to try to see how closely we're matching supply and demand. And so what we first asked is to tell us how their operating or production capacity compared to pre-COVID levels. And what we basically know is that from the depths of the pandemic in April, when things were a shelter in place, we know that capacity has opened up since then. But in terms of over the coming months after that, in May, July, and then what they expect in September, what you see is that there's some improvement in operating capacity. So the green parts are either at or above capacity, pre-pandemic levels. Okay, and this is 75% or above. So we thought this would be a reasonable show that things are kind of getting back to normal. And we are seeing that there's a small improvement over time, that businesses are opening up their capacity more. So that's that's the good news. The bad news is it's not opening up that much more, particularly between July and September. We're really not seeing capacity in businesses expand that much. So then I think some people think that might be a policy-driven thing. And whether it is or not, what we're also seeing, though, is when we ask about customer demand and whether or not it aligns with operating capacity, what we're seeing is that most businesses are still not at a customer demand level where reduced capacity even matters. So we're seeing that most firms are still seeing demand that is well below what their capacity is. And again, that seems to be improving, but I would say very, very slowly. Okay, so customer demand really seems to be lagging even the restrained production capacity we have right now. We're also curious about knowing, kind of what measures can we ask about to see whether things are kind of going back to normal. And as everyone's familiar with, many are working from home, as I am as well. And so we wanted to ask whether or not that was changing much. Are people going back to the office more? And again, the answer is yes. There are more firms sending workers back to the office more, but there is still, even by the end of the year, there's an expectation that roughly 25% of firms will be seeing more than 50% of staff time at home, and then another share that will be seeing a significant chunk of time, less than 50%, but still a significant chunk of time at home. So again, we're getting a little bit more back to normal, but we're also a little bit in a holding pattern in terms of things kind of really going back to anything what we would consider or recognize as normal. We also asked about solvency. So we asked how in the current conditions, how long could your firm stay solvent? And what we're kind of looking at is this 1 to 3 month window. Not that 4 to 6 months doesn't matter, but in this pandemic where things are really immediate and volatile, I think this 3 month window is a little bit better measure of how things are. And there's kind of good news and bad news. There's roughly 16% of firms that right now believe they probably can't last more than 3 months under the current conditions. The good news is that we're seeing some steady improvement in that solvency measure. It was closer to 28, 29% in earlier surveys. Okay. Part of that, though, again, from a composition standpoint, I want to let attendees know that there might be some of the improvement might be from the fact that because we're going through partners and they're going out to the same folks, there might be some that are dropping out. So we know that businesses have been under stress. We know that some are going under. There may be some improvement in this measure simply because some respondents are dropping out because they're no longer in business. So then lastly, we also asked about the outlook for the remainder of 2020. And it depends on whether you're a half full or half empty person. What we found is that in a half full standpoint, roughly about half of respondents are not pessimistic. In this environment, I actually see that kind of as a win. If all of the circumstances surrounding this pandemic, you still have either a neutral or especially optimistic outlook, that's fantastic. This is a terribly challenging environment. Half empty is that circumstances remain tough for many firms. Roughly half of firms have some pessimistic view, even believe that they're likely to go out of business. For those businesses that are out there right now listening, I wish you luck, and I understand that it's tough to run a business to begin with. In a pandemic environment, it's tough times 10. So I wish all the businesses out there a lot of luck, and I'm hoping that this chart in particular, I'm hoping that this can shift to the right as we continue to survey. So moving forward, I just want to touch base briefly on a few things. So we're continuing to track COVID in new ways. So we're going to continue our survey work. There's a professional services firm out there, professional services survey out there right now. But we're also collecting more and better real-time measures of economic activity. And I just want to very briefly point attendees to this COVID-19 dashboard that we have up on our website right now. I'll just offer a few insights on a couple of charts just to give you a feel for what's on our website right now. So you have some you have one chart that essentially tracks foot traffic mobility. And you have it, if I can point your attention down to the bottom, you can look at all of these you can turn on and off various things. So you can look at movie theaters, sit-down restaurants, bars, malls, and you can track foot traffic in the various states, and you can turn on or off any of these states in particular. So there's a lot of functionality to these charts. We're also looking at Google mobility reports, and kind of same thing. You have different geography measures as well as different points of contact that you can turn on and off. So there's really a lot of functionality to this dashboard, and I would really encourage folks to go visit at minneapolisfed.org and take a look at our dashboard. And lastly, I just want to let everyone know that I will be doing the same webinar exactly at this time next week, August 27th, 9 to 9:30. We did a construction market survey. We got more than 600, just about 650 responses from participants across that 9th district, and I'm going to talk about those results a week from now, August 27th, 9 to 9:30. We would love it if you could join us for that as well. I'm just going to point here. Carmi is going to put the link for the registration to that webinar in the chat box, and we hope that you would be able to join us for that as well. Otherwise, look for announcements via social media, as well as some other ways that we'll try to get information out on that particular webinar. So that concludes the formal part of my presentation. As Carmi had mentioned, I'm going to be taking some questions now. And what I would really love also is any additional feedback that people might have now that I'm done with the formal part of my presentation. I'm also happy to go past 9:30 a little bit if folks have a lot of questions. And if you have to get going at 9:30 or even right now, again, I just want to thank you very much for taking the time today and watching this presentation. I hope it was useful to you and your business. Thanks much. Carmi, I'm wondering if there's any questions.
Yeah, if folks could find their chat box at the bottom of the screen and select to host in the chat box. If you have a question, you can type that there. While we're waiting for those to roll in, Ron, this is, I believe, your 4th survey of general business conditions since the pandemic. What have you learned across the 4 surveys you've done? What's changed?
Right. Thanks for that, Carmi. And again, please offer some questions. I'd love to be able to take them. So, interesting. So we did our very first survey in, I believe it would have been very early April, and then we did it 2 weeks later, and the frequency is starting to elongate a little bit. So we've done 4 altogether, thousands of responses, and I guess what I would say, some of it is reflected in some of the charts that I talked about. In terms of things that have changed, there is an evolving response, and we're seeing some improvement, so that's what's changing. But it's really gradual. I would say solvency in particular, we've seen the most improvement of, in kind of a good sense. Again, what we don't know is to the extent that our composition of respondents is staying the same. That's my hope. But again, these are snapshot surveys, so it's really tough to compare on an apple-to-apple basis. The things that are not changing, I would say, is that we're still seeing a total impact that's really tough on businesses. It's pretty clear to me that the stimulus has helped, especially in the comments that we get. Again, those for this survey alone, we got 1,100 responses, but we got 3,500 open comments, and most of them were not one or 10 words. Many of them were a sentence or several sentences long. So we really got a really good feel. We get a really good feel every time we do these for how businesses are really being impacted kind of on a granular level. And the thing that's not changing is the extent to which businesses are negatively impacted and trying their darndest to adapt to the new conditions. I'm always really encouraged when I read comments about how hard people are working, not only for their firms, but for their workers. What I also come away from is that there are just a lot of struggles out there. That's the thing that unfortunately is not changing as much as I would hope.
Can you talk a little bit about your data on wage cuts? Do you have any insight into whether they're more prevalent in some sectors versus others, or some states versus others?
I probably, if the person who asked that question maybe wanted to send me an email address, I'll follow up in more detail. What I can tell you is that I think it's very safe to say the areas that are probably seeing the largest wage cuts are those that are seeing the highest revenue cuts. So those firms that are seeing the strongest revenue cuts are in entertainment, food, and those kinds of restaurants. Any that are based on crowds. If you're a facility that has that caters to weddings or things like that, if you've seen more staff cuts, I think it's very safe to say that those that are remaining are likely probably being exposed to wage cuts as well. So I think it probably aligns very closely with where revenue cuts are the strongest from a sectoral standpoint.
Do you have any thoughts on the long-term future for those industries like bars and restaurants?
First, good luck, and I mean that really from the bottom of my heart. I know you're in a very, very difficult circumstance right now, one where there are difficult decisions from a policy standpoint, which make decisions for you even tougher. In terms of projections, I really try to stay away from that only because what I've seen more than anything is that we're in uncharted territory. So for me, I guess the best I can say is that we're starting to see gradual improvement. I would expect to continue to see gradual improvement if we continue to see improvement in terms of our management of the virus itself, or if we manage to get control of the virus itself. I don't know, for those that may be familiar with President Kashkari's recent op-ed and his position on the virus, his belief basically that we have to get control of the virus if we're expecting to see stronger recovery. And I think if that's the case, if we can get more control of the virus, where consumers feel more comfortable to go out, consumers feel more comfortable about the future where they can get back to a little bit closer to normal spending patterns, then I would say I see positive results going forward for everybody, but especially those that have been more impacted. If we don't get a hold of the virus, if we continue to see infection rates that make consumers nervous, then I'm a little more nervous about what might lie in the future.
We've got several more questions in the chat box, so we will go a little bit beyond 9:30. If folks do need to leave us, if you could please, when you exit the WebEx, click the red X at the bottom of your screen rather than closing your browser entirely. This will present you with a pop-up survey so you can give us feedback for our next webinars in this series. So Ron, did you in any of your surveys ask any capital investment questions? Do we know anything about CapEx?
No, that's we don't on this. In part because we're very cognizant about survey fatigue, and so we try to keep our surveys we try to keep them tight. Actually, let me back up. In the very first one, we were talking, and in the construction survey as well, we are talking more about capital investment. And what we've basically seen is that early on, not surprisingly, we saw CapEx is really getting pulled back. We haven't asked since early in the pandemic, but that's probably a question now. Now that we're getting a little bit farther in and things are at least getting more steady state, that we're going to likely start asking more. In our general research and our contact with businesses, I think it's very safe to say that CapEx is the thing that's probably getting pulled in. When the future is cloudy, I think that's one of the things that you're going to invest in the future, and the more confident you are of what's going to happen in the future, you're more likely to invest in capital expenditures for the future. And so I think, not surprisingly, we're seeing some pullback on that right now.
Any thoughts about the state of the supply chain? We know that was a problem earlier in the pandemic. Are we still seeing that?
Without question. And I guess this is not to give away some results from my construction survey. That's really what I heard in the construction survey, is that construction is such a supply intensive business. And what I heard is that supply chains are really lots of little supply chains connected together. So there are lots of chances for those chains to break, and that's what we are hearing. Not only in construction, lots of businesses that depend on supplies, manufacturers as well, are definitely seeing supply chain issues. And it's not only because there's really so many different opportunities for that supply chain to break. It can happen at the manufacturing site. It can happen in the distribution. It can happen any number of ways, not only because of, maybe might be a lack of workers. There might be an actual case of COVID where people have to take some time away out of the manufacturing plant or at the trucking firm. And it's those kind of interruptions that we're still seeing a fair amount of, yes.
Do we know anything about businesses that are clustered around airports or travel destinations versus Main Street businesses? Are they being impacted more severely?
I don't have any data on that specifically. I guess what I would say is those businesses, the one thing I do know is because we get data from district airports on travel, and what we are seeing is that we're still only about 35%. Travel right now is at about 35% of normal levels. So any of those businesses that are around airports that are, whether you're a distribution firm, if you are a hotel that's located around an airport, without doubt, those have been dramatically impacted. We're also seeing in terms of other kind of other sectors, what we are seeing some improvement in is if you happen to be in a tourism area that is outdoor based, we're actually seeing fairly strong activity in those areas and a significant improvement from earlier in the pandemic. So there are some areas that are seeing, again, kind of what I talked about earlier. There are some areas, some sectors that are being differentially impacted by COVID. And I think that's going to continue rolling forward.
How long, Ron, do you intend to keep doing these surveys so that we can continue to see the change over time?
Right now, what I'm actually hoping is, for right now, these will be indefinite, where I'm really hoping to do these on a quarterly basis, so long as I can get partners to continue to buy into the idea that we need this information. And again, just a shout out to all my partners who have just been fantastic through this process so far. It really is through them that I'm able to do this, and it really is kind of on a case-by-case basis. If things all of a sudden happen to snap back to normal, and maybe partners and businesses aren't as interested in the information, maybe we'll have to discontinue this. Right now, what I'm hoping is that we've seen that this information is not only necessary and useful for the bank, but that it's useful for the business community. And so my hope is that this will be an ongoing survey across the 9th District indefinitely.
Do you anticipate any changes coming up with the winter season? There's a question about the 6-month period for solvency that you were referring to seems to be more appropriate since winter will hit us in the 9th District hard.
Well, I guess what I would say is those seasonal businesses that really bank on a strong summer to get through the winter, I think that I don't think there's any question those firms are wondering what the future holds. In terms of other sectors, maybe like construction, I am hearing that there might be some slowness in terms of future work, but I would really point back to infection rates. Again, with cold weather coming in, we've heard that the virus might be a little bit, because we're going into more closed quarters, the potential for spread, I think, is higher, and we're also running into the flu season. So if you can fast forward to December and January and you can tell me what infection rates look like, I'd have a more confident answer of what I think we might be looking at. But I don't think there's any question, again, because of the nature of the seasonality of some businesses, I think winter is going to present some additional challenges.
Changing gears a little bit to the PPP, some attendees on the call have found that to be very helpful. Do we know the percentage of businesses in the 9th District that have received PPP funds?
Well, we have. What I can tell you is that we asked that question, and thanks for asking that. We asked the question, and among our survey respondents, roughly about 75% have received PPP support. And I think in general, I think that's not far off from what I've seen among applicants themselves in total. But what I don't know is how many especially small businesses, very small businesses, sole proprietors, weren't eligible for the program. The program is more geared towards those with employees, and so I think where there was maybe where firms didn't get it is probably on that lowest end. But for the most part, larger, small to medium businesses used it and used it very effectively, to my knowledge.
And I believe this is the last question that's been submitted, and you've touched on it a little bit, but are there any other positive notes? You mentioned outdoor tourism maybe getting a little bit of a bump. Any other bright signs that you see from industries that are maybe picking up as a result of COVID?
I think manufacturing has managed to our demand has shifted. And so not all manufacturing firms clearly have benefited, but there are clearly some areas of manufacturing for consumer goods that have benefited tremendously because of our shift. We're buying more groceries, so the restaurant sector has been affected because we're not eating there, but we are buying more consumer products. Target just announced a record improvement in their quarterly revenues. Grocery stores are doing very well. So there are certain segments that have taken advantage or benefited from, might be the better word, benefited from that shift in consumer demand. So some of those sectors I would point to probably as those that are benefiting the most.
Great. Thanks, Ron. That's all the questions that we have in the chat box. Just a little reminder, when you leave us, if you hit the red X at the bottom of your screen, it will bring up an evaluation form for you. Thank you for joining us.
And I want to also thank everyone for attending. I hope to see some of you on the August 27th call. And for any businesses out there that are respondents to the surveys that we're putting out, first I want to say thank you. And again, I want to wish you good luck. Have a great day.